Hi, folks. This is James, your host for JW Mystery, True Crime, and Horror Stories. Just want to get on here and say thank you so much for checking out this video. If you like horror stories and true crime content, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. That way you can stay in the loop for all of my new videos, and that way I can help boost the algorithm and get my videos out there a lot more. That way I can continue to make more content. Again, thank you so much for watching this video. And now, to the stories. My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. She always has been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she normally does. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror movies. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through the first half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks, and it's not just her cup of tea. And that's fine, but that's what's so strange about this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she never has had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I had had some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a little bit late that morning, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee, and as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, that's when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes and a strand of her long dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her. I did burn the shit out of my lips, though. "Geez, Lynn," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared me." She immediately popped out of view like a kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for her. But I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted that I love her and called her a weirdo as I shut the door behind me, and I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, a jug of OJ in hand, when I felt the strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back at me. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, I'll admit it, not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment, I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her or even yell at her. I just stood there, frozen in shock, wondering what had just possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to the bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side of the bed asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathe to be sure she was really asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I had dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her on the cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her coffee cup, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. "You were peeking at me again. From over there," I said, pointing at the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, she started laughing. She laughed so hard I couldn't help but join her. "You creep me out sometimes, you know that?" I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck. "You creep me out all the time. So I guess we're even," she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds of her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or the living room curtains. Once she even managed to get inside of her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She had the lid propped up, just enough so that half of her face was peeking through. She had been grinning like an excited toddler. It was really unnerving. Didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her what on earth she was doing. She didn't answer, but she slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away. I felt really disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small, devious smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started feeling paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner or behind the door. I was jumping whenever I was at home, especially when she wasn't in full view of me. I felt so stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks, without another incident, I began to relax, stopped checking behind the furniture and the walls, and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then just a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I had lounged on the couch and played a couple of games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I hopped in the shower and I was washing the soap from my hair and felt that awful feeling I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a freaking heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long, dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open with a terrible grin, eyes wide and red as if she hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks with two black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted, some of you might say. But joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with that crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in the bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at a joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in the bathroom for over an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. "What the fuck, Lynn?" I snapped. "This shit is getting really, really old and annoying." I waited for her to apologize or to call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan. So quiet I wondered if I heard it at all. "Lynn?" I called out, not able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response from her, just my own breathing. "I swear to God, Lynn, just stop it," I yelled. I pounded my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I would expect from me talking to her like that. I never screamed at her before. But there was just nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower. I won't deny I was scared, too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like a freaking lifetime when you're that scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in the bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door and mentally preparing myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me nauseous today. A moan. Louder than before, but this time I was able to tell where it came from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion and locked my eyes with Lynn, who was peeking at me from a slight gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open with the most grotesque gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't scream. I was too scared for even that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room. I ran outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting close. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the whole time, either from fear or cold. probably a little bit of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring every call and text I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I had gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me I could stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I were having a fight, but I didn't get into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up, instead of being so serious all the time? I had wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she had been there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She never left the bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me sleeping pills, so I was able to get a little bit of rest. But unfortunately, my sleep was filled with terrible dreams. All of it was of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up just as the sun started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I had to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she wouldn't do that creepy crap anymore. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that, when the familiar feeling came over me. I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted from the ceiling, almost on her own. And there she was. Her face pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring at me with the same gaping smile. Except now drool dribbled down from her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she had been there, but something told me she had been there for quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming though. I was afraid anger trumped any fear I had felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home. Now," I shouted. She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving upstairs. As if Lynn could hear them from her place outside, her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she had been there were the 2 streaks of drool dripping from down on the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical, but who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but There were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Animal, probably, Chris guessed. And I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I had dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out from work that day and turned off my cell. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at this point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her. No matter what promises she made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I had figured I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that, especially after 6 years. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she had sent. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same. All texts telling me she loved me and she wanted me home. And how worried she was. But not one text addressing the crazy stuff she had pulled. Like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to get me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after her bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from the situation, but if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered on all fours like some wild animal grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then you'd think my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry because it's not my place. But this fight, something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming too nosy. I don't know yet. She's a completely different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of all the craziness I had been dealing with. People change, Ben. But she's still the same person you married. Maybe both of you just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, Rebecca said. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung my heart. I missed and I loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, Rebecca said. I don't know about that. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in. And when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked. Rebecca nodded casually as if the fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber or something, Rebecca said. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? Sweat started to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind me. No, she just asked if you were awake yet, and I said you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she just said no and to let you sleep. That's all? She didn't say anything else, I asked. No. She looked awful, though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little better at the knowledge that at least she didn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check the doors and make sure they were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. I hadn't sworn an oath to love her, to honor her through sickness and health, and clearly she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believe she was, I had to try to get her the help that she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? My wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she had been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyways. The police would have probably just said that I was overreacting. But this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. Dangerous, even. Like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband, I was well within my rights to have her committed. But what if she simply acted normal in their presence? She obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do in my position. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long, exhausting conversation with him and his wife Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into that yet, but I told them about our last encounter and how she hid in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankful they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird maybe, but not dangerous. Just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for you too, Rebecca offered. Chris didn't think we should involve police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do this his way. At least I wouldn't be going in that house alone. We drove over this morning just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began to do somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was open, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes through the gap. I was shaking, and I was starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. The house was deadly quiet and dark. Despite being 10 in the morning, all the curtains were closed up tight, refusing any light to come inside. If I hadn't left just 2 days ago, I'd thought the house was abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place she might hide, occasionally calling her name. "Why are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked. Are we looking for your wife? Let's just go upstairs, I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom or the spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of broken glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn's and my wedding portraits that hung up on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all of the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church, after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be the source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that, so we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since that night. I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something? I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside of our closet, I came across the source of the smell, and I gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and the smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were large as quarters, while some were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she had collected, and I wondered how she had gotten them, and I shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But wow, your wife's in here collecting eyeballs, Chris said. Ben, I think we should go. I'm getting nauseous. Alright. I grabbed my duffel bag and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag. Who lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I told you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs an exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell. His words died in his throat. His eyes grew with fear. I didn't ask him why. I already knew. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered, as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled up on her side, watching us with excitement, just like a kid on Christmas morning. It was Lynn. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she had been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making, a sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was so unnerving, to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted she was still the same woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements as if she was nodding. Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some sort of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let out a tiny moan, and I still had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as big as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and I immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled. They trembled more and more as I got closer, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand, but before I could get even close to her, her hand sprang towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell backwards. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down on the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. "Are you all right in there?" Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She wasn't smiling either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris in the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. "Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from underneath the bed with the glass still in her fist. "Chris, run!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move, because a second later I felt my back jump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from underneath the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in absolute rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers onto the floor. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris said. "You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Chris," as I said quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider, so much so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed some serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her, and then she started sprinting towards me, grinning in utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck. her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds. I shook her off of me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore up the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone. He had called the police. I didn't say a word, I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched in the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there running after us, but I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course she wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or a relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could get one. But none of those things would matter. Somehow, I just knew. I dropped off Chris at his home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I'd been the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she needed. But now I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. It was just 3 words. I found you. There was a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our street whistling softly. You can only hear it if you're in the living room or the kitchen when they walk by, and it always starts exactly at 3:03 in the morning. The sound starts faint, somewhere near the beginning of the lane near Carson Place. We're towards the middle of the street, so the whistling moves past us, fading away in the direction of the cul-de-sac. When I was younger, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen some nights to listen. Mom and Dad didn't like that, and we'd catch hell if they found us out there. But they were never too hard on us since we always stuck to the one big rule. Don't try to look at whatever was whistling. My neighborhood is a funny place. I lived here since I was 6 and I love it. The houses are small but well kept. Good-sized yards. Plenty of spaces to roam. There are a lot of other kids here my age. I turned 13 back in October. We grew up together and would always play foursquare in the cul-de-sac or roam around from back porch to back porch in the summer. This was a good place to grow up, and I'm old enough to see it. There's only 2 strange things that happen here. The night whistling and all of the good luck. The whistling never bothered me much. Like I said, I couldn't even hear it from my bedroom. But my mom and dad don't like talking about it, so I've stopped asking questions. My dad is a strong guy, tall and calm. He has an accent since he moved to the U.S. as a kid. His family, my grandparents, they're from the islands. That's what they call it. My dad, the only time he isn't so calm is if the whistler comes up. He talks a little quicker, his eyes move faster, and he tells us not to think about it so much and to always remember the one rule, the big rule. Don't try to look outside when the whistler goes past. Not that we could even look if we wanted. See, there are shutters on the inside of every window. Thick pieces of heavy canvas that pull down from the top and latch to the bottom of the window frame. Each latch has a very small lock, about the size of what you'd find on a diary. My dad locks those shutters every night before we all go to bed and keeps the key in his room. My mom, I don't know what she thinks about the whistling. I've seen her out in the living room before at 3:03 when it starts. I could see her if I cracked my door open just an inch to peek. She's not out there often, at least I haven't caught her much. But once or twice a month, I think she sits out there on her big red couch just to listen. The whistler has the same tune every night. It's actually cheerful. Remember how I said there are two odd things about where I live? Well, besides the night whistler, everyone in my neighborhood is really lucky. It's hard to explain, and our dad doesn't like us talking about it. But good things just seem to happen to people around here a lot. Usually it's small things, winning a radio contest or getting an unexpected promotion at work, or finding some arrowheads buried in the yard. You know, like the authentic kind. Weather's pretty good, there's no crime, and everybody's gardens bloom extra bright in the fall. A million little blessings. I've heard my mom say that about living here. But the main reason we stay here, why we moved here in the first place, is my sister Nola. She was born very sick. Something with her lungs. We couldn't even bring her home when she was born, only visit her in the hospital. She was so small. Small even compared to the other babies. She had to have a machine to help her breathe. We moved into our house here to be closer to the hospital. But as soon as we moved here, Nola started getting better. The doctors couldn't figure it out. They chalked it up to whatever they were doing, but we could all tell they were confused. But my parents knew. Even I knew. Nola getting better was just another one of those million little blessings we got for living in our neighborhood. So that's why we stayed, even after we found out that for every small miracle that happens here every day, now and then, some bad things happen. But they only happen if you look at the whistler. See, our neighborhood has a welcoming committee. They show up with macaroni casserole in a gift basket and a manila folder whenever someone moves in. They're very friendly. 4 people show up when we moved back 7 years ago. The committee made small talk, gave me a Snickers bar, and took turns holding Nola. It was her first week out of the hospital, so they were extra careful. Then the committee asked to speak to my parents in private, so I was sent to my room where I still managed to hear every word that they said. The welcoming committee told my parents about the nice neighborhood. Really exceptionally. Hard to explain. Kind of nice. And they told my parents about the even harder to explain whistling that happened every morning at 3:03 and ended at the tick of 3:05. The group, our new neighbors, warned my parents that the whistling was quiet, would never harm or hurt us as long as we didn't look at the whistler that was making the sound. This part they stressed, and I pushed my ear to the door, straining to hear them. People who went looking for the whistler had their luck change, sometimes tragically. A black cloud would hang over anyone that looked. Anything that would go wrong would. The manila envelope the committee brought over contained newspaper clippings. Stories about car crashes and ruined lives, public deaths, and freak accidents. Not everyone dies, I heard the committee tell my dad, but the life goes out of them. Even if they live, there's no light in them ever again, no presence. My mom, I could tell she wasn't taking it seriously. She kept asking if there was some prank that they were playing. At one point, my mom got angry and accused the committee of trying to scare us out of our new home, and asked them if they were racist on account of my dad being from the islands. My dad calmed her down, told her he could tell our new neighbors were sincere and that they were trying to help us. He explained that he grew up hearing these kind of stories from his mom and that he knew there were strange things that walked among us. Some of those things were good and some were bad. Most were just different. After the committee left, Dad went out to the hardware store, bought the canvas blinds, the latches, and the locks, and installed them on every window in the house after dinner. That first night in our new house, I crept out of my room at 3 a.m., only to find my dad awake, sitting on the living room couch, holding my sister. My dad held up his finger in a shh motion, but patted the couch next to him. I sat, and we waited. Exactly 3:03, we heard the whistling. It came and went just like our neighbor said. The whistling returns each night, and we never look, and we enjoy our million little blessings every day. Nola breathes on her own, and she's grown into a strong, clever girl. My dad even joined the welcoming committee. We don't get new neighbors often. Why would anyone want to leave? But when a new family does move in, my dad and the committee bring them a macaroni casserole, a gift basket, and the manila folder. I can always tell the look on my dad's face when he comes back if the family took the committee seriously or if we'd be getting new neighbors again very soon. Not long ago, a family moved in directly next to us. The previous owner, Miss Maddie, passed away at age 105. She lived a good long life. Our new neighbors seemed like they'd fit in just fine. They believed the welcoming committee and took my dad's advice about locking the shutters since they have a very young child of their own. Whatever the newspaper clippings were in the manila envelope, whatever evidence, my dad never let us see. But I imagine it would have been awfully convincing to our neighbors. One night when our neighbors had to leave town, they sent their son Holden to stay with us. He was 12, a year younger than me in school. I didn't know him well before that, but as soon as his parents dropped him off after dinner, I could tell it was going to be a bad time. "Do you know who's always out there whistling every night?" Holden asked. The three of us were sitting in the den, some Disney movie playing idly on the television. My sister and I exchanged a glance. "We don't talk about that," I said. "I think it's that weirdo that lives in the big yellow house on the corner," Holden said. "Mr. Tolles?" my sister asked. "No way, he's really nice." Holden shrugged. "Must be a psycho killer then." Nola tensed. "We don't talk about it," I repeated. "Now let's go into my room and play Nintendo." We spent the next few hours playing games, eating popcorn, and then watching movies. A typical sleepover, but I could tell Holden was getting antsy. After my parents had wished us a good night, locked the blinds, and gone to bed, Holden stood up from his beanbag and walked over to Nola and myself, sitting on my bed. "Have you ever tried looking?" he asked. "It's nearly time." Like most sleepovers, we conveniently ignored the suggestion of bedtime. I was shocked to see that he was right. It was almost 3 a.m. I sighed. "We don't... See, I can't even try to look because my dad locks the blinds every night and hides the key." "So does our dad," said Nola. "No," Holden replied. "No, he doesn't." "You saw him do it," I said, a little sharper than I meant to sound. Holden grinned. "Your dad locks the blinds, yeah, but he doesn't hide the key. He keeps it right on his normal keychain." "So?" I asked, worried I already knew what he would say next, because I had noticed that my dad didn't bother hiding the key anymore after all these years, because he knew that we took it seriously. "So after your dad locked up before your parents went to bed, I went to the bathroom, and on my way, I may have peeked into the room, and I may have seen your dad's keychain on his nightstand, and maybe I went and borrowed the key." Nola and I stared at his grin, which grew only wider. "You're lying," I said. Holden shrugged. You can check if you want. Just open your parents' door and look. You'll see his keychain right there on the nightstand. Stay here, I told both of them. Don't move a muscle. I hurried over to my parents' room, but hesitated at the door. If Holden wasn't lying, my dad would be very angry. Beyond angry. I was scared thinking about it, but more scared of an open window with a whistler right next to it. I opened the door barely an inch and looked in, but it was too dark to see. I took a deep breath and I walked into the room. 2 steps into the dark, I froze. 3:03, the whistling started. I could hear it clearly. From my parents' room. I never realized, but they must have heard the sound every night since we moved into the house. But they never told us. I don't think I could have slept through that. I stood there listening to the whistling come closer, unsure whether I should turn on a light or call out for my dad. Soft sounds from the living room brought me back to reality. Nola, I yelled, running out of my parents' room. Holden and Nola were standing near the front door next to a window. Holden wasn't lying. I could see him fumbling with the lock on one of the blinds. I heard a click. He did have the key. Holden let out a quick laugh. Nola stood next to him, hunched up, afraid but maybe curious. The whistling was right outside our house now. I think I made a sound. Called out? I can't remember. Time felt frozen, clock hands nailed to the face. But I found myself moving. I'm not fast. I've never been athletic. Somehow, though, I covered the space between myself and Nola in a moment. My eyes were locked on her, but I heard Holden pull the blind all the way down so I could see it release. I heard the snap of it starting to raise, and I heard the whistling just on the other side of the window. But I had my arms around Nola and turned us so we were facing away from the window. At the time, I jammed my eyes shut with the blind whipping open. The whistling stopped. I felt Nola shaking in my arms. Don't look, okay? I told her. Don't turn around. We were positioned so that she was facing backwards towards the hallway, and I was facing the window. My eyes were still closed tight. I felt her nod into my shoulder. I reached out with the arm not holding Nola and tried to touch Holden. My hand brushed against his arm. He was shaking worse than Nola. Holden? I asked. Silence. I reached past him and gingerly felt for the window, eyes still sealed shut. The glass was cold against my fingertips, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I moved my hand up the window, searching for the string to the blind. The glass began to get warmer the further I reached, and there was a gentle hum feeding back into my fingertips. I tried not to think about what might be on the other side of the window. Finally, I touched a string and yanked the blind shut. I opened my eyes. In the dim light leaking out of the kitchen, I could make out Holden, pale and small, staring at the now closed window. Holden? I asked. He turned towards me and screamed. Everything became a flurry of motion. Lights sparked to life in the hall, then the living room. My parents' footsteps thudded across the hardwood floor. I didn't turn to look back at them. My eyes were glued only to Holden. He was pale. He had bit his lip so hard there was a thin, red line of blood running down his chin. And worst of all, he had wet himself. What happened? My dad asked from behind me. I managed to swivel away from Holden and look back, and I uttered, He looked. I'd never seen my dad scared before, but I saw it that night. In that moment, an old, ugly terror stitched on his face, a parent's fear. Just Holden, he mouthed to me. I nodded yes. My dad let out a breath. He looked so relieved I nearly expected him to cheer. But then he turned to Holden, and my dad's face changed. I wonder if he felt bad for feeling good that Holden was the only one that looked. There was a knock at the door. We all froze, and Holden whimpered. "Don't answer it," my mom said. She stood at the threshold of the hall. I'd always thought she was a skeptic and just humored my dad about the windows and the Whistler, but that night we were all believers. I noticed that both my parents held baseball bats. They must have taken those from their room. The knock came again, a little louder this time. "Please don't open the door," Holden whispered. My dad walked over to him, hugged him close. "We won't," my dad promised, still holding his bat. "Nothing is coming in here tonight." Thud, thud, thud. This time the knocking was loud enough to rattle the door. Holden screamed again, and Nola clutched her arms around my neck. My mom came over and knelt down next to us, wrapping my sister and me close. Thud, thud, thud. "Call the police," my mom whispered to my dad. The knocking instantly stopped. My dad looked over his shoulder at us. "Do you think he was cut off by frantic knocking that trailed off into a polite tap, tap, tap?" "Police," something said from the other side of the door. The voice from the outside sounded exactly like my mom, like a parrot repeating the words back to her. "Police. Call the police." Tap, tap, tap. "Police." My mom pulled us closer. "Police. Police. Police. Police." "Please stop," I heard her whisper. "I don't think calling them will help," my dad said. "How will we know when they are the ones on the other side of the door?" The knocking came back harder than before. The door shook, then it stopped. After a long moment, I heard the knocking again, but it was coming from the back door. We all turned together towards the back door, but the knocking immediately returned to the front. Front to back, back to front, loud then quiet, then loud again. Suddenly the sound was coming from both doors, big heavy blows like a sledgehammer. Then something started tapping against all the windows in the house, then all the walls. It was like we were living inside of a drum with a dozen people trying to play at once. "Stop!" Holden yelled. The knocking died. "I won't tell," Holden said, staring at the door. "I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw. Please just go away." He waited for nearly a minute. Then we heard it. A soft tap, 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 coming from the window Holden had looked through earlier. Holden started to cry, sobbing like a prisoner watching the gallows being built outside their cell. My dad held him. He brushed his hair, but never lied to him, never told him things were going to be okay. The tapping at the window went on for the rest of the night. We huddled together in the living room for I don't know how long. Eventually my mom tried to take us kids into the room while my dad stayed and watched the door. But the second we moved into the bedroom, the knocking came back so loud it was possible to ignore. I was afraid the door couldn't take it. We went back to the living room and the knocking stopped. Only the tap, tap, tap on the window remained. None of us slept that night. The tapping stopped around 7 a.m. That's about the time the sun comes up here. We waited another 2 hours before my dad opened the blinds from one window. He made us all go back to my parents' bedroom first. I heard him open the door and then come back in. "Okay," he told us. "It's done." Holden's parents came back around lunchtime. My mom and dad walked Holden over to his house and they all went inside for quite a while. Noel and I watched from the window. She stuck to me the whole day, right at my side, sometimes holding my hand. When the parents came back, they looked grim, but they wouldn't tell us what they said to Holden's family. It was a Sunday, so we all spent time together, ordered pizza, and watched movies. At night, everyone slept in my room. Nola and my mom in the bed with me, and my dad in the chair he had pulled over. There was no knocking that night, or any night since. We didn't see much of Holden or his parents for the rest of the week, but by Thursday there was a moving truck in their driveway. Nola and I watched them pack up the whole afternoon after school. What sticks with me is how tired Holden and his family looked. All three of the same All three had the same grim mouths, with lightless eyes. Even from across the street, I could tell something was very wrong. Holden and his family were gone before sunset. I remember the original welcoming committee saying to my parents when we moved in, "Not everyone who looks at the Whistler dies, but even those who live have the light taken out of them, and the rest of their lives are full of misfortune. A million little tragedies." I think Holden's parents must have looked, either to comfort him or if they didn't believe or share the burden if they did. I watched Nola some days, happy and young and alive, and I wonder if I had been slower, if she had looked out the window that night, would I have looked too? To comfort her? To share that burden? I'm glad I don't have to find out. We still live in that house, in that neighborhood. We still hear a whistler walking past every night. The blessings, the luck, the good things here are too good to leave. But we're really careful now. We don't have friends over to spend the night anymore, and my dad hides the keys to the blinds very, very well. Not that I've gone looking. Some things you just don't need to look for. Hi, folks, this is James. Again, just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to these stories. It really means the world to me. And if you enjoyed this and you are looking forward to more content similar to this or any true crime content, smash that like button, hit the subscribe button. It would mean the world to me. I can't thank you enough. And until next time, stay safe.